Today we're talking about your new book that is, as of our recording, hasn't come out yet, but will be coming out soon, called The Toxic War on Masculinity. And so just to kick off the conversation about this, why did you decide to write a book about masculinity in our culture?
Well, for starters, of course, it's very obvious that men are being attacked in our culture in the sense of masculinity itself being demeaned as harmful and toxic and dangerous. It was very easy to start the book with several provocative quotes. The Washington Post had an article called "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Wait a minute. To say something so bluntly in a respected mainstream publication, this is no longer on the fringe, the feminist fringe. This is now mainstream that you can just attack men. Or the Huffington Post said her New Year's resolution was to kill all men. Or you can buy T-shirts now that say things like, so many men, so little ammunition. Books have come out with titles like No Good Men, I Hate Men, and Are Men Necessary? So no wonder, this is a stat that just came out, by the way, for International Women's Day. A statistic came out in Britain. 55% of men say that, and let me read it to you. It says, society has gone so far in promoting women's rights that it is now discriminating against men. 55% of men say that. Whether you agree or not, that's a lot of men. Mm-hmm. And actually, what surprised me even more, though, was that men themselves have kind of jumped on the bandwagon. I was able to find quotes. Let me see. You may have seen this one because it was not that long ago. The director of the movie Avatar wrote, "Testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system." Or it's a best-selling science fiction writer, Hugh Howey. Testosterone is the problem. Women should be in charge of everything. Or a book by a man saying, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So I was astonished to find even men saying, denigrating their own sex. So clearly one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book is that I wanted to say, where is this coming from? Where's this incredibly negative view of masculinity coming from? How can we explain it? How can we respond to it? But the final trigger, actually, in deciding to write the book was when I saw how much Christian men are kind of treated as Exhibit A. The main example of toxicity is said to be Christian men. Evangelical men, and anyone who's theologically conservative and who believes in some sort of male headship in the home. And that was easy to find too. I found both secular and Christian people. Let me read you a couple of these quotes. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. Or another quote, it's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. A theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So I thought, okay, wow, it's not just a problem in our culture, it's probably exacerbated even in Christian culture, that Christian men are treated as the worst examples of patriarchy and oppression to women and abuse and control and so on. And then I read the sociological data and found out that was none of it was true. So this is why I just had to write the book, because it's hidden away in the academic literature and it's not getting out. But the sociologists looked at these charges and said, well, where's your evidence? You're making all these charges. Where's your evidence? And so they started doing studies, and I quote, I think about a dozen sociologists who've been doing work on this. My go-to one, the one who's done the largest study, is Brad Wilcox, who teaches at the University of Virginia and is head of the Institute for Family Studies. So I'll quote him in particular, but he says, okay, where are the studies? Where's the evidence? Where's the data? Well, it turns out that sociologists have been finding for the last few decades that evangelical Christian men who are really, authentically committed to their Christian faith, who attend church regularly, actually test out as being the most loving to their wives. By the way, they do interview the wives separately, which is important. Their wives themselves report being the happiest with their husband's expressions of love and affection. They're the most engaged with their children, both in terms of shared activities like sports or church youth group, as well as discipline like setting bedtime, setting limits on screen time. Mm-hmm. And they have the lowest level of divorce and the lowest level of domestic violence of any group in America. So the sociological facts totally debunk the charges against Christian men. And even Christians don't know this. Christians are not tuned in to the sociological data. And so I said, okay, I have to get this out. Yeah. I have to get this information out so that Christian men know that, in fact, they are doing very well. Let me give you a quote from Brad Wilcox. He's my top sociologist. He was, yes, here it is. It's in my notes here. So he wrote an article in the New York Times, of all places. So when I say Brad Wilcox, you need to know that he's considered maybe the top marriage sociologist in the nation. Mm-hmm. And he does get articles into the New York Times and the Washington Post and Slate and so on. This was in the New York Times. It was for Valentine's Day, and a progressive writer had written in saying, "Oh, progressive marriages are much happier." And so he wrote a response. And they published it, and he said, you're right. Progressive marriages are happier than average because they are more intentional. Right? They are trying harder. But he said, let me show you my evangelicals. It's kind of a J curve. Let me show you my evangelicals. They test out much better than even progressive secular people. And here's how he puts it. It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. So the happiest wives in all America. But the reason they're testing the wives in particular, of course, is the accusation that these men are abusive and that they're chauvinistic, insensitive patriarchs, that they're oppressive, that they disempower their wives, that they're abusive, and so on. So it's very important that they say, well, what are the wives reporting? Mm-hmm. Fully 73% of the wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services with their husbands actually are the happiest of all wives in America. Mm. Now, again, a lot of evangelicals are not reading the New York Times, so we miss this. This is the main reason I wrote the book. I really wanted to encourage Christian men and women, Christian marriages. They actually are doing very well by comparison with the rest of society. In fact, here's how Brad Wilcox ends. He has a whole book on the subject, and here's how he ends it. He says, because he's so widely known, a lot of secular people read his stuff, and they're like, well, wait a minute, you're saying church has this impact? I even had a secular friend who was very skeptical of these findings. She said, well, maybe it's not that Christian men are better. Maybe it's that better men are attracted to church. To which I said, yeah, well, then what is it about church that attracts good men? You still don't win. But, but but Brad Wilcox said it's kind of funny watching him. As a Christian, you're watching him explain to secular people. Actually, church does do some good.
Yeah.
And he says, actually, listen. Here's how it works. Church going does actually expose men to messages telling them that the family was created by God. It's not some evolutionary accident. It's not just a cultural construct. Church tells men that they are accountable to God for how they treat their family. Here's how he puts it. Let's face it, it's one of the few institutions in the United States where men encounter other men who are interested in talking about fatherhood and marriage. And, in encouraging one another to do better. You don't find it at work. You don't find it in sports. You don't find it at the local tavern. But in church, and this is a direct quote, in church what you do find is a message and an ethos that is family-focused and gives men the motivation to attend to their families. And he concludes, talking again to secular academics, secular academics need to cast aside their prejudices. I love that. Cast aside their prejudices, that is, their prejudices against evangelicals. About religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Theologically conservative family men are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So this is great news.
Yeah.
And like I said, we don't really know this because when I give this information, I often get pushback, even in Christian circles, by people who say, well, wait a minute, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of society? Right? Haven't you heard that? Mm-hmm. Well, so the researchers went back to the data, and what they did is they divided out the men I've been talking about, which are the truly committed, authentically devout Christian men who attend church regularly, versus nominal Christian men. So I used this phrase in my classroom the other day, and people didn't even know the term nominal. Technically it means in name only. Nom is Latin for name. Nominal means in name only. So these are Christians who, in these surveys, they might check the Baptist box because they live in Georgia. They live in a culture that's more culturally Christian, or their family background, but they actually don't attend church very often, if at all.
Yeah.
The numbers were stunning. They were shockingly different. Nominal Christian men have the worst marriages. In other words, their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They are the least engaged with their children. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men. And they have the highest level of domestic violence, higher than secular men. So if you put these two groups together and just measure evangelicals, you're going to get skewed statistics.
Yeah.
That's why we haven't figured this out before. You have to unpack truly committed Christians from nominal Christians. Because the nominal Christians are skewing the statistics. They're ruining the reputation for everyone else, for all the rest of the Christians. And here, let me quote Brad Wilcox again, because he wrote about this in the magazine Christianity Today. And he said, the most violent husbands in America, with the italicized, that's his writing, he italicized the most violent husbands in America, a Protestant evangelical men who attend church rarely or not at all. So this is what we're up against, like in our churches, is that we need to recognize that there are men hanging around the fringes of the Christian church who hang around enough to pick up language like headship and submission, but not enough to pick up the biblical meaning of those terms, and who infuse those terms with secular concepts of domination and entitlement and control and so on, and who end up, as a result, even worse than secular men, according to the surveys. So that's what we're up against in terms of churches. We need to figure out how we're going to address these men who are out there in public identifying as Christian, identifying even as evangelical, but who are living worse than secular men.